Today we will be dipping our toes into a worldview from one of the subcultures of the Western world. Put on your anthropologist hat and leave your own cultural biases at the door. I first heard about this subculture more than a decade ago from a classmate who sincerely believed this. I call it the Chad hypothesis. The story goes that this only applies to heterosexual people, ages 16 to 28 approximately. Within this age range, a quote, normal unquote man has a stable job, an apartment outside of his parents' house, a vehicle, a somewhat sociable attitude, and is not out of shape physically. A quote, Chad unquote is a type of man in this age range who is handsome, at least 6 feet tall, gregarious, extroverted, white skinned, and muscular. This hypothesis proposes that being smart, kind, or funny are irrelevant. They may be able to break a tie in a competition, but do not overcome the other attributes. The quote, good old days, unquote, were a narrow period of time after the Industrial Revolution until shortly before the Feminist Revolution. In other words, we're talking about 1850 to 1900. The hypothesis proposes that there is a direct correlation between a man's chadness and the attractiveness or existence of his girlfriend. By definition, only 20% of the population of heterosexual males within the age range can be chad. This is similar to how an IQ of 113 or higher is the top 20% of people. The hypothesis asserts that most men would prefer to have sex with as many attractive women as possible, while being held responsible for 0 children. Anthropologists note there are several reproductive strategies used by animals. Humans usually use the high investment, low quantity of children method, but there is variation within the species, so some humans attempt the low investment, high quantity strategy that this hypothesis asserts is widespread among the narrow demographic that it applies to. As with other ape species, there are often multiple reproductive strategies at play even within a single community. A lead chimp will have a harem of women, some of whom will sneak off to mate with other male chimps in the group, and this often leads to violent competition between males to establish dominance over the group. Alternatively, bonobos use intercourse as a social adhesive, maintaining bonds, settling arguments, and exchanging greetings. Back to the Chad hypothesis. Over the past 50 years in the Western world, wages have remained mostly stagnant when adjusted for inflation, while entry requirements have ballooned and productivity has skyrocketed. In modern times, it is common for entry-level office positions to require university degrees, sometimes even asking for years of experience. Whereas, in the 1970s, any high school dropout could answer the phones and operate an adding machine. The economic system has forced higher and higher percentages of young adults into education and debt. Instead of buying a vehicle for themselves in exchange for a few weeks' labor at age 18 or 19, young people are now staying in school until 22, then saving up for months to afford their first vehicle. Wealth inequality allows some to graduate debt-free with a vehicle already paid off, using their parents' money, while others expect to continue paying off their student debt for more than 10 years. This relates back to the criteria to be considered a normal man in the Chad hypothesis. Anyone stricken by poverty, obesity, or any type of handicap is excluded from the demographic that the hypothesis discusses. According to the hypothesis, women who want to date but do not want a pregnancy in their 20s are the primary demographic enforcing the Chad versus normal divide. Women who are looking for a lifetime commitment are excluded from the hypothesis, since they would be judging the men based on different criteria. Analyzing that narrow demographic of women, we see some overlap between the Chad hypothesis and the sexy son hypothesis. The sexy sun hypothesis has been used to explain the feathers on male peacocks. Despite it diminishing their survivability against predators, it actually increases their reproductive success. Subconsciously, the peahens view a male with such a massive handicap as necessarily very good at surviving. To have reached this age, so her offspring, male and female, would likely inherit those survival skills. If we apply this to humans, the idea is that a certain demographic of women will allow their impulses and sexual desires to determine who they mate with in early adulthood. Subconsciously, if they are sexually attracted to a man, their sons are likely to be sexually attractive to women of the next generation, and their genetic line is likely to continue. Going with the flow and following instincts and impulses is in contrast to consciously thinking about things like income, responsibility, fatherly ability, safety, stability, and sustainability. Women thinking about those things are more likely to be looking for a long term mate and are thus excluded from the demographic that the hypothesis applies to. The Chad hypothesis asserts that during ovulation, women become more intensely attracted to these Chad men and are simultaneously less attracted to normal men. Further research and testing is required to determine if this assertion holds any water. A competing hypothesis asserts that during ovulation, heterosexual women are more attracted to all men, not just the most attractive ones, using the same pattern behind hunger. When you are hungry, all food tastes better, not just the food that you already enjoyed when you aren't hungry. Since cultural descriptions of sexual attractiveness change over time, it is difficult to study such hypotheses. For example, prominent large breasts have only been considered attractive since the 1600s. Before that, wide hips were considered far more important than breasts. Further back in history, a large belly and pale skin were considered sexually attractive because it signified wealth and prosperity, since the woman was obviously well fed and did not have to do manual labor outside of the house. If the Chad hypothesis was accurate regarding its narrow demographics of men and women in 2005, was it still accurate in 2010 or 2020? With the speed at which fashion changes in modern times compared to history, is it reasonable to conclude that the public opinion of which physical features are considered sexually attractive would also change more rapidly in modern times? Does the heterogeneous ethnic makeup of many Western cities have any influence on the application of the Chad hypothesis to their citizens? As a side note, I think that the percent of empirical observations which concur and support the hypothesis is very important. If 100% of observations agree with a hypothesis, then it is treated as a fact, no matter how narrow the criteria is to properly apply the hypothesis. If 90% of the observations support it, then it is accurate but with exceptions. If 60%, then it's a stereotype. If 30%, then it's bigotry. If 10%, then it's a conspiracy theory. That concludes our testing the waters. I have barely scratched the surface of the notes that my classmate and I made together. I think it's only right that we waited until we were no longer part of the age range that the hypothesis applies to before taking a retroactive look at it. As you can tell from my side notes and anthropologist's notes, I wasn't completely able to suspend my own cultural biases which oppose this hypothesis. But it gets easier with practice. I believe that strengthening this technique of viewing ideas from other cultures without trying to enforce your own beliefs on them is beneficial to help people navigate the modern multicultural world. Put a thumbs up if you agree, or a thumbs down if you disagree.